In Victorian England, the schoolhouse was more than a place of education. It was a symbol of order, morality, and progress. At a time when industrial growth was transforming cities and villages alike, schools stood as pillars of discipline, designed to shape children into productive, obedient citizens. Parents trusted them. Communities depended on them. Few places carried such an assumption of safety. The schoolhouse at the center of this story stood on the edge of a modest English town, surrounded by narrow lanes, brick terraces, and rows of soot-darkened chimneys. Built of stone and timber, its windows tall and narrow, it served dozens of local children each day. Inside, rows of wooden desks faced a raised platform where lessons were delivered with strict regularity. Attendance was compulsory, punctuality expected, and silence enforced. The children who passed through its doors came from working families, laborers, clerks, shopkeepers, many of whom viewed education as a rare opportunity for advancement. For some, school offered warmth during winter months and structure amid the uncertainty of Victorian life. For others, it was a rigid institution governed by rules, discipline, and authority figures whose word was rarely questioned. Among the staff was a single schoolmaster, respected and feared in equal measure. He was regarded as educated, dependable, and morally upright, entrusted not only with instruction, but with maintaining order. In an era where authority was seldom challenged, his position carried significant influence. Parents deferred to him. Children obeyed him. Inspectors praised his discipline. Nothing about the school suggested danger. Lessons proceeded as they always had, reading, arithmetic, handwriting interrupted only by the occasional scolding or the sound of chalk against slate. The building closed its doors each afternoon, its rooms falling silent until the following morning. To the outside world, it was a place of learning and routine. But beneath that routine, something was wrong. In the weeks leading up to the incident, subtle changes began to appear. A few children complained of unease, though their words were vague and easily dismissed. Some claimed they disliked staying late after lessons. Others spoke of locked doors when they should have been open, or of being asked to remain behind when the rest of the class was dismissed. In Victorian England, such concerns rarely traveled far. Children were expected to obey, not question. Parents, burdened by long hours of work, trusted the institution. A schoolhouse was not a place where danger was expected. The idea that something criminal could take place within its walls seemed unthinkable. The building itself, after all, represented progress and moral instruction. Then came the day when routine was broken. It was a weekday afternoon when the school doors failed to open at their usual hour. Children were not dismissed on time. A few parents noticed the delay but assumed lessons were running late. When several pupils emerged in silence, pale and unsettled, questions began to circulate. One child was missing. At first, there was no panic. Children wandered off. They hid. They returned home late. These things happened. But as minutes stretched into hours, concern hardened into alarm. The missing child had last been seen inside the schoolhouse. A search began almost immediately. Neighbors checked nearby streets, yards, and alleyways. The surrounding area offered no sign. As daylight faded, attention returned to the school itself. The doors were unlocked. The rooms were empty. Lessons had ended. Chairs were pushed in. Slates lay abandoned on desks. Nothing appeared disturbed. It was only when someone suggested checking the rear of the building, an area seldom used by pupils, that unease turned into dread. Storage rooms, cupboards, and unused spaces were opened one by one. These were areas children rarely entered, places reserved for supplies, tools, and old furniture. Spaces that existed but were largely forgotten. What was found there would shatter the reputation of the schoolhouse forever. The discovery was not immediate. It came quietly, without the drama often imagined in later retellings. A door opened. A shadowed space was examined, and then someone saw something that did not belong. The reaction was swift and restrained, as was typical of the time. Authorities were summoned. The building was closed. News traveled quickly through the town, carried by whispered conversations rather than printed headlines. Parents gathered outside the schoolhouse demanding answers from officials who had none to give. By evening, it was clear that a serious crime had taken place, one that had occurred inside a building meant to protect children, not endanger them. The shock was not merely about what had happened, but where it had happened. The violation of that space was deeply unsettling. Police began their work under immense pressure. The town wanted certainty. Parents wanted reassurance. Inspectors demanded explanations. Yet from the very beginning, the investigation faced a troubling reality. The schoolhouse offered few clues, no signs of forced entry, no clear witnesses, no obvious suspects. The question that haunted everyone was simple and impossible to answer. How could something so serious happen inside a schoolhouse without anyone seeing, hearing, or stopping it? By the time the sun rose the next morning, the building stood silent once more. But it was no longer a place of learning. It had become a place of suspicion, fear, and unanswered questions. And the investigation was only just beginning. When authorities arrived at the schoolhouse that evening, the building no longer felt familiar. What had been a place of orderly routine hours earlier now carried an unmistakable tension. Lamps were lit despite the remaining daylight, their glow casting long shadows across the stone floors and wooden walls. The air inside felt heavy, disturbed, as though the building itself resisted scrutiny. The search resumed under official supervision. Every room was examined carefully, beginning with the main classroom where lessons had taken place earlier that day. Desks were inspected, cupboards opened, drawers pulled free. Nothing appeared out of place. Slates lay where children had left them. Chalk still dusted the ledge beneath the blackboard. If a crime had occurred there, it had left no visible trace. Attention shifted to the smaller rooms beyond the classroom: cloakrooms, supply cupboards, and storage areas seldom used by pupils. These spaces were narrow and dim, filled with stacked furniture, spare books, and cleaning implements. In Victorian schools, such rooms were rarely organized. They existed for utility, not oversight. It was in one of these forgotten spaces that the truth emerged. The door was partially concealed behind stacked benches. When it was opened, the smell was the first indication that something was wrong. Inside, among unused materials and old crates, lay the child who had failed to return home. The body had been concealed deliberately, positioned to avoid immediate discovery. There were no signs of struggle in the surrounding area, suggesting the act had occurred quietly, away from witnesses. Those present reacted with restraint, though the shock was unmistakable. In keeping with the customs of the time, the child was not disturbed until a medical examination could be arranged. The room was secured. The schoolhouse was sealed. Word was sent for the local coroner. By nightfall, the town understood that this was not an accident. The post-mortem examination conducted the following day confirmed what many feared. The child had not died naturally. The injuries indicated deliberate harm. While the exact details were recorded with clinical precision, officials avoided public disclosure, mindful of the distress already spreading through the community. What troubled investigators most was not only the crime itself, but the conditions that allowed it to occur. The schoolhouse had been occupied throughout the day. Children had come and gone. Lessons had proceeded. Yet no one had raised an alarm. No cries were reported. No unusual disturbance had been noted. This suggested something deeply unsettling. The act had likely been carried out by someone familiar with the building, someone who understood its rhythms and its blind spots, someone who did not need to force entry or act in haste. Suspicion naturally turned inward. The schoolmaster was questioned first. As the sole authority present throughout the day, his movements were of immediate interest. He provided a detailed account of the lessons taught, the pupils present, and the times at which children were dismissed. According to his statement, nothing unusual had occurred. The missing child, he claimed, had been present earlier in the day but had left with the others. Yet attendance records told a more complicated story. One entry had been altered. The change was minor, easily overlooked, but investigators noted it carefully. When asked about it, the schoolmaster attributed the discrepancy to a clerical error. Other staff were questioned, though the school employed few. A cleaner who visited in the early morning hours reported nothing unusual. A visiting inspector had not been present that day. No outsiders were recorded as having entered the building. The lack of witnesses created a dangerous vacuum, and the absence of clear evidence, rumors flourished. Some parents insisted the child must have wandered back inside unnoticed. Others believed an intruder had taken advantage of the school's open doors, but these theories struggled against the facts. The building showed no sign of unauthorized entry, and the concealment suggested planning rather than chance. As police examined the layout of the schoolhouse, they began to understand how such a crime could occur unnoticed. The storage rooms were isolated from the main classroom. Sound carried poorly through the thick walls. Once lessons ended, children were dismissed in groups, leaving little opportunity to notice who remained behind. Investigators also learned that pupils were sometimes asked to stay late for extra instruction or discipline. Such requests were common and rarely questioned. A child lingering after class would not have seemed unusual to classmates or parents. This revelation narrowed the field of suspects further. Community reaction grew increasingly strained. Parents demanded explanations. Some withdrew their children from school entirely. Others confronted officials, accusing them of negligence. The schoolhouse, once a source of pride, became a symbol of betrayal. Press coverage began cautiously. Victorian newspapers often avoided sensationalism in cases involving children, but the unusual nature of the crime drew attention. Reports emphasized the respectability of the institution and the shock felt by the town. Details were restrained, yet the implication was clear. Something had gone terribly wrong behind those walls. The police, meanwhile, faced growing pressure to act. Without physical evidence pointing decisively to a suspect, they relied on behavior, opportunity, and character assessments tools commonly used in the era. Every adult connected to the school was scrutinized. Conversations were revisited. Small inconsistencies were magnified. One troubling detail continued to resurface. Several pupils, when questioned gently, admitted they had been afraid of staying late at school. Their accounts were hesitant, fragmented, shaped by fear rather than certainty. None accused anyone directly, but their unease was unmistakable. To Victorian investigators, this posed a dilemma. Children's testimony was often considered unreliable, yet ignoring it entirely risked overlooking something crucial. The balance between skepticism and attention would shape the course of the investigation. By the end of the second day, authorities had reached an uncomfortable conclusion. There was no evidence of an outsider. The crime had occurred during normal school operations, and whoever was responsible had acted with confidence, familiarity, and control. The schoolhouse was no longer simply the scene of a crime. It had become the center of suspicion. And as the investigation deepened, the list of possible suspects would grow shorter, while doubt, fear, and accusations spread far beyond the school's walls. By the third day of the investigation, the question was no longer what had happened inside the schoolhouse, but who could have done it, and how such an act could occur in plain sight without drawing immediate attention. In Victorian England, where social order relied heavily on reputation and hierarchy, this question carried consequences far beyond the case itself. The inquiry narrowed quickly, not through evidence, but through proximity. The schoolmaster remained the central figure of interest. He was the last adult known to have authority over the building, and his daily routines were well established. Investigators reconstructed his movements hour by hour. He maintained that after lessons concluded, he remained in the classroom preparing materials for the following day. He claimed to have seen nothing unusual and heard no disturbance, yet this explanation raised further doubts. The room where the body was discovered was not far from the main classroom. For the crime to occur without sound suggested either remarkable timing or familiarity with how the building muted noise. The idea that the act could have taken place unnoticed challenged the assumption that constant oversight existed within such institutions. Still, suspicion alone was not proof. Investigators expanded their focus to other adults with access to the building. Clergy members connected to the parish school were questioned, as were caretakers and individuals who occasionally assisted with maintenance. None admitted to being present at the relevant time. Records confirmed that most had not entered the premises that day. Attention then turned to behavior rather than access. Witnesses from the surrounding area were asked if they had seen anything unusual: someone leaving the schoolhouse late, a child lingering after dismissal, an unfamiliar figure near the grounds. Accounts varied. Some claimed to have seen a child walking alone near dusk. Others recalled nothing out of the ordinary. Memory, shaped by shock and rumor, proved unreliable. As formal avenues narrowed, informal judgment began to take over. Victorian society was deeply invested in moral character. Past behavior, temperament, and perceived respectability often carried more weight than physical evidence. Under this lens, every individual associated with the school was evaluated not just for opportunity, but for perceived virtue. The schoolmaster's demeanor came under scrutiny. He was described as reserved, disciplined, and distant, qualities once praised, now reinterpreted as coldness. Some parents recalled moments when discipline had seemed severe. Others insisted he was merely strict, as was expected of men in his position. Contradictory impressions fueled division. One group of parents defended him vigorously, arguing that to accuse a man of education and standing without proof threatened the very foundations of public trust. Another group believed his authority made him capable of abuse unchecked by oversight. The schoolhouse, once a neutral space, became a battleground of opinion. Investigators also examined the possibility of a second adult, someone who might have been overlooked. A former assistant teacher was questioned. The record showed he had left the area weeks earlier. A local tradesman who occasionally delivered supplies was interviewed, but his visits were documented and brief. Each line of inquiry ended the same way: suspicion without certainty. As days passed, pressure mounted on law enforcement to act decisively. Newspapers began publishing editorials questioning whether justice could be served when institutions were allowed to investigate themselves. While names were not printed, implication lingered heavily between the lines. The children, meanwhile, were not forgotten. Authorities revisited pupil testimony with greater care. Several children described being asked to remain after class on previous occasions, sometimes for minor infractions or additional instruction. This was not unusual, but the lack of supervision during these moments troubled investigators. When asked directly whether the missing child had been told to stay behind, none could say with confidence. Fear shaped their silence. Victorian children were taught obedience above all else. Speaking against authority, even in tragedy, was unthinkable for many. Investigators recognized this barrier but struggled to overcome it. Gentle questioning yielded little. Firm questioning risked further trauma. One detail, however, began to trouble officials. A child reported that on the afternoon in question, the missing pupil had seemed hesitant when the bell rang. She had gathered her things slowly, glancing toward the front of the room. When asked why, the child said she did not know, only that something felt wrong. The statement was vague, but it lingered. Despite growing suspicion, no arrest was made. The evidence remained circumstantial. The coroner's report confirmed deliberate harm, but offered no identifying marks. There was no weapon recovered. No blood was found outside the concealed room. No belongings were missing. In a modern sense, the case lacked forensic grounding. In a Victorian context, it lacked the moral certainty required to accuse publicly. This uncertainty fractured the community. Some families demanded the school's immediate closure. Others feared that doing so would imply guilt before facts were known. Religious leaders urged patience, warning against false accusation and collective hysteria. Their sermons emphasized restraint, even as fear continued to grow. Behind closed doors, however, doubts hardened into quiet conclusions. Children were kept home. Parents crossed the street to avoid certain neighbors. Conversations stopped abruptly when unfamiliar figures approached. The schoolhouse stood empty, watched not as a place of learning, but as a reminder of vulnerability. For investigators, the case reached a troubling impasse. They had motive without proof, opportunity without witness, and suspicion without confession. In an era before standardized investigative procedure, such stalemates often resolved, not through discovery, but through pressure. And pressure was building. The question was no longer whether someone inside the schoolhouse was responsible. It was whether the truth would ever emerge, or whether doubt itself would become the lasting verdict. By the time the case reached its final stage, the truth had become less a matter of evidence and more a matter of endurance. Weeks had passed since the discovery inside the schoolhouse, and yet no arrest had been made. The machinery of Victorian justice, slow and cautious by design, struggled to operate in the absence of certainty. What remained was a case shaped as much by fear and restraint as by fact. The coroner's inquest was the last formal attempt to impose order on what had become a deeply unsettled affair. Witnesses were called again, their statements repeated, scrutinized, and compared. The schoolmaster testified once more, his account unchanged. He denied any wrongdoing, denied any knowledge of how the child came to be alone, and denied hearing anything that might have suggested danger. His composure remained intact, though observers noted that his manner had grown noticeably strained. Medical testimony confirmed what had already been established. The death was deliberate. It had not been an accident, nor the result of illness or misadventure. The child had been alive when concealed, and death followed soon after. Beyond that, the examination could offer nothing that pointed to a specific hand. The inquest concluded with a verdict that satisfied no one. The jury returned a finding of unlawful death by person or persons unknown. It was a phrase commonly used in Victorian England when the limits of investigation had been reached, and it carried an unmistakable implication. A crime had occurred, responsibility existed, but the system could not or would not name it. Public reaction was immediate and divided. Some interpreted the verdict as a quiet admission of failure, proof that authority had protected itself at the expense of truth. Others saw it as the only honest outcome in a case where accusation without proof would have destroyed lives unjustly. Newspapers reflected this split, publishing editorials that alternated between outrage and restraint, suspicion and caution. The schoolhouse itself became the focus of symbolic judgment. Classes were suspended indefinitely. Parents refused to send their children back, even as officials insisted there was no evidence of ongoing danger. The building, once a symbol of discipline and progress, now carried an atmosphere of unease. Windows remained shuttered. The doors stayed locked. No official closure was announced, but functionally the school ceased to exist. The schoolmaster did not return. Within weeks of the inquest, he resigned his post and left the area. No formal charges had been brought against him, and legally he departed as an innocent man. Yet his departure was interpreted in conflicting ways. Some viewed it as an act of dignity, a recognition that his presence had become untenable regardless of guilt. Others believed it was a silent admission, a retreat made possible only by the absence of definitive proof. He was never tried. His name faded quietly from public record. For the family of the child, there was no such quiet ending. Without a conviction, there could be no closure, no sentence, no explanation. The loss remained suspended in uncertainty, compounded by the knowledge that the truth, if known by anyone, had never been spoken aloud. In Victorian society, unresolved cases carried a particular burden. They were not just failures of justice, but moral wounds. Communities depended on the belief that wrongdoing would be identified and punished. When that belief fractured, trust eroded slowly, often invisibly. Years passed, and the case slipped from headlines into memory. Occasional references appeared in local histories and whispered conversations. Some claimed to know what truly happened. Others insisted the wrong conclusions had been drawn entirely. Over time, speculation hardened into legend. The schoolhouse became associated less with education than with warning, a place parents reference without details, using implication rather than explanation. The absence of resolution allowed every theory to survive. Some believed the crime had been committed by someone within the institution, shielded by position and silence. Others argued that an outsider had exploited routine and familiarity, escaping before suspicion could take shape. A few insisted the truth had been obvious from the beginning, ignored only because acknowledging it would have exposed deeper failures. None of these versions could be proven. All of them endured. What remained undeniable was the structural reality the case revealed. Victorian institutions relied heavily on trust, hierarchy, and reputation. Oversight was limited. Safeguards were assumed rather than enforced. When those assumptions failed, the system lacked the tools to respond decisively. The child's death exposed that weakness with brutal clarity. In the years that followed, reforms were discussed: stricter supervision, clearer protocols, increased accountability within schools. Whether these changes came directly from this case or from broader societal shifts is difficult to determine. What is certain is that the tragedy became part of a growing awareness that respectability alone could not guarantee safety. The schoolhouse itself was eventually repurposed. Some said it became storage. Others claimed it was quietly demolished. Records are unclear, and perhaps intentionally so. Erasing the physical reminder may have seemed easier than preserving a space associated with unresolved horror. But erasure did not mean forgetting. The case lived on precisely because it lacked an ending. Unlike crimes solved and punished, this one resisted narrative closure. It forced those who remembered it to sit with discomfort, to acknowledge that justice was not inevitable, and that truth did not always surface. In that sense, the crime hidden inside the schoolhouse became something larger than a single act of violence. It became a symbol of what happens when certainty is absent, when silence prevails, and when systems designed to protect fail quietly rather than catastrophically. The Victorian era prized order, progress, and moral clarity. This case offered none of those things. It ended not with a sentence, but with a question, one that lingered long after the doors of the schoolhouse were closed. And that question remains: not simply who committed the crime, but how such a crime could occur at all inside a place built on trust, beneath the illusion of safety, in a world that preferred resolution, even when truth was beyond reach.